Two stories were born on the same day. One was given a cover. It was pressed flat, copied carefully, and stored where time could not easily reach it. It learned how to survive by being written. The other was never given a title. It passed through skin and breath, through shock and endurance. It survived only as long as the bodies that carried it could remember. The first manuscript speaks clearly. It selects what deserves to remain. It preserves dates, losses that can be counted, disruptions that can be summarized. The second manuscript does not speak at all. It contains no margins, no neat conclusions. What it holds is considered improper for ink, dangerous for memory, inconvenient for preservation. History chose between them. It kept the story that could be organized and buried the one that could not be safely told. What follows is not a forgotten story. It is the one that was never allowed to be written. The Chronicle tells us the year first, 793, carefully preserved, anchored to the calendar so the event can never drift. The number is stable, reliable, easy to repeat. What the Chronicle does not preserve is how time felt to the people inside it, how a morning became a rupture, how hours lost their shape. Time is fixed on the page, while experience is allowed to dissolve. The Chronicle tells us the place next. Lindisfarne, a holy island, a center of learning and devotion. The name appears intact, dignified, untouched by what followed. What the Chronicle does not linger on is how fragile the place actually was, how isolation that once meant sanctity also meant exposure. Geography is treated as background, not as a condition that made harm possible. The Chronicle tells us who arrived: foreign raiders from the sea, outsiders, strangers. The category is sufficient. The word explains everything it needs to. What the Chronicle does not explore is why naming the intruders matters more than naming the lives already there. One group is defined, the other remains general. The Chronicle tells us what kind of event this was: a raid. The word is efficient. It signals disorder, intrusion, and departure. A raid begins and ends cleanly on the page. What the Chronicle does not consider is what the word excludes, what happens when an event does not conclude when the attackers leave, when consequences extend beyond the shoreline and refuse to stay contained. The Chronicle tells us what was lost: treasure, gold, sacred objects, items whose absence can be measured by empty spaces on shelves. What the Chronicle does not inventory is anything that cannot be cataloged: fear, disorientation, the destruction of personal boundaries. Loss is defined only by what once had monetary or symbolic value. The Chronicle tells us who died: monks, servants of God, men whose roles were recognized by the institution that recorded their deaths. What the Chronicle does not ask is who survived and in what condition. Death is granted significance. Survival is treated as an administrative afterthought. The Chronicle tells us the attack was sudden, swift, unexpected. The shock itself becomes the story. What the Chronicle does not describe is the moment after surprise passes, when comprehension sets in, when people realize that what is happening will not be brief. The page records impact, not endurance. The Chronicle tells us that order was broken, sacred space violated, peace disrupted. The emphasis remains on the insult to holiness. What the Chronicle does not dwell on is the human cost of that violation. Stone walls and holy ground receive more attention than the bodies that occupied them. The Chronicle tells us the attackers departed. They came, they took, they left. The sequence is reassuringly linear. What the Chronicle does not explain is what departure meant for those who remained, or for those who did not remain at all. An ending is declared because the chronicler needs one. The Chronicle tells us this moment mattered. It marks the beginning of something larger, a new era of fear, a turning point in history. What the Chronicle does not specify is who paid for that turning point in ways that history would never follow. Importance is assigned at the level of civilizations, not individuals. The chronicle tells us the account is sufficient. A paragraph, sometimes only a few lines, is deemed adequate. The event is summarized, then placed among other events. What the chronicle does not justify is why such compression is acceptable for some kinds of suffering and not others. The chronicle tells us what to remember: violence against a religious institution, loss of sacred property, the shock to Christendom. What the chronicle does not instruct us to remember is anything that complicates the moral clarity of that memory. The chronicle tells us how to feel: outrage, fear, a sense of cosmic disorder. These emotions are safe, communal, and easily shared. What the chronicle does not invite is discomfort, especially the kind that demands sustained attention rather than immediate condemnation. The chronicle tells us the victims were holy men. Their identities are legible within the record. Their suffering fits within a framework that can be mourned publicly. What the chronicle does not acknowledge is that holiness was not limited to those whose roles were officially recognized. The chronicle tells us the violence was external. It came from beyond the world being described. The danger is positioned outside the community. What the chronicle does not examine is how violence, once introduced, rearranges life inside that community long after the outsiders are gone. The chronicle tells us the raid was an aberration, a shocking departure from normalcy, a moment of chaos in an orderly world. What the chronicle does not confront is whether that order depended on not asking certain questions in the first place. The chronicle tells us the attackers were brutal. The label absolves the need for further explanation. Brutality becomes a character trait rather than a set of actions with specific consequences. What the chronicle does not clarify is who absorbed the weight of that brutality once the page turns. The chronicle tells us the monastery was desecrated, sacred objects defiled, holy ground violated. What the chronicle does not explore is how desecration of space differs from desecration of people, and why one is easier to record than the other. The chronicle tells us the story is over. The ink dries. The event is sealed. What the chronicle leaves no room for is aftermath that stretches into years, carried quietly by those who were never meant to become part of the official narrative. The chronicle tells us this is a story of loss, but it defines loss narrowly. What can be counted is counted. What cannot be measured is omitted. What the chronicle does not question is whether the most profound losses are often the least visible. The chronicle tells us the event belongs to history, safely distant, interpretable, settled. What the chronicle does not admit is distance itself is a privilege, that some consequences were never granted the luxury of becoming past. The chronicle tells us that memory has been preserved, that nothing essential has been forgotten. What the chronicle does not consider is preservation is also a form of editing. The chronicle tells us this is the beginning of the Viking Age, a label broad enough to carry centuries. What the chronicle does not pause over is how beginnings often require the compression of individual suffering into symbols. The chronicle tells us the meaning of the event. It was a warning, a sign, a turning tide. What the chronicle does not explain is meaning for whom, and at whose expense that meaning was constructed. The chronicle tells us what deserves emphasis: dates, places, institutions, objects. What the chronicle does not elevate are experiences that resist structure, that cannot be summarized without losing their weight. The chronicle tells us we now understand what happened. The account feels complete, satisfying in its clarity. What the chronicle does not do is ask whether completeness is the same as truth. The chronicle tells us the suffering can be closed. A line break follows. The narrative moves on. What the chronicle does not recognize is that some stories do not end simply because they are no longer being told. The chronicle tells us this is enough. Enough detail, enough sorrow, enough explanation. What the chronicle does not justify is who gets to decide when enough has been said. The chronicle tells us to remember Lindisfarne for what it represents: the vulnerability of faith, the shock of invasion, the dawn of a violent age. What the chronicle does not ask is what Lindisfarne represented to those whose lives were altered in ways the record never followed. The chronicle tells us to turn the page, and so we do. What the chronicle does not warn us is that turning the page does not mean everyone was able to leave the story behind. The chronicle tells us this is the official story, preserved, cited, repeated. What the chronicle does not admit is that an official story is not the same thing as a complete one. The chronicle tells us that history has spoken, clearly, confidently, with authority. What the chronicle does not acknowledge is how much authority depends on silence. The chronicle tells us what happened at Lindisfarne, but it tells us only what can survive being written. What it leaves behind is not accidental. And at this point, the record appears to rest, not because there is nothing more to say, but because it has reached the edge of what it is willing to remember.
Where are the women? That is the first question the record never asks. And it is also the question that unravels everything that follows. The sources describe a religious community, but they do not specify its full composition. They name monks, they mention servants, they speak of a functioning spiritual center, but they do not stop to ask who sustained that life beyond the men whose titles were formally recognized. The silence begins there. If Lindisfarne was a living religious center, who maintained it? The records do not answer. They move past daily life entirely, as though monasteries operated without labor, care, or human complexity. The implication is not that women were absent, but that their presence was considered too ordinary to record. If the monastery produced food, clothing, and hospitality, who performed those tasks? The chroniclers do not specify. They assume function without naming hands. The implication is that labor not tied to clerical authority was invisible by default. If Lindisfarne housed religious life, were women permitted nearby? The records grow thin here, but ecclesiastical practice does not. Across early medieval Britain, women lived in religious communities, as nuns, as anchoresses, as servants bound to sacred institutions. The implication is not speculation, it is structural reality. If women lived and worked within or near religious spaces, why are they absent from the account of the raid? The chroniclers offer no explanation. They do not deny women's presence, they simply do not mention it. The implication is not that women were spared, but that their fate was not considered narratively essential. If men are named as victims, why are women not named as survivors? The records make no distinction. They list death carefully. They list stolen objects meticulously. They do not list displaced lives. The implication is that suffering without martyrdom did not qualify for remembrance. If Lindisfarne was attacked suddenly, who was awake, who was vulnerable, who was unable to flee? The chroniclers do not ask. They compress human response into a single word: chaos. The implication is that chaos absolves the historian from tracing individual outcomes. If women were present, were they counted among the dead? The records are silent. They enumerate slain monks, they do not enumerate anyone else. The implication is not that others did not die, but that their deaths did not serve a theological purpose. If women survived, where did they go? The chroniclers offer no paths of flight, no records of refuge, no return narratives. Lives that continue beyond the event vanish entirely from the text. The implication is that survival without institutional meaning was unworthy of documentation. If women were taken from the site, why does the record not follow them? The sources do not acknowledge removal as a category of harm. They record theft of objects. They do not record theft of people. The implication is that bodies were treated differently depending on gender. If the chroniclers knew captivity existed in the world they described, why does the word not appear here? The silence is deliberate. The vocabulary was available. The choice not to use it is itself a decision. The implication is avoidance, not ignorance. If the attack shocked Christian Europe, why does outrage focus on desecrated space rather than violated lives? The chronicles emphasize sacrilege. They mourn broken sanctity. They do not linger on broken people. The implication is that institutions were considered more sacred than individuals who served them. If this event was meant to instruct future generations, what lesson was being protected by omission? The record teaches fear of outsiders. It teaches vigilance. It teaches moral contrast. It does not teach empathy for the unnamed. The implication is that empathy was not the goal. If women had been present and harmed, would recording that have complicated the narrative? The sources do not speculate, but the structure of medieval historiography offers an answer. Sexual vulnerability did not fit easily into triumphal or martyrdom frameworks. The implication is that complexity was edited out. If women had been taken, how would that reflect on the community left behind? The chroniclers do not explore shame. They do not examine guilt. They do not interrogate failure to protect. The implication is that silence preserved communal dignity. If women were integral to the monastery's daily existence, why are they irrelevant the moment violence occurs? The record offers no rationale. Presence dissolves into absence at the moment it becomes inconvenient. The implication is that relevance was conditional. If names grant permanence, what does the absence of names guarantee? The chroniclers do not ask this, but the effect is clear. Unnamed lives do not persist in memory. The implication is erasure through omission rather than denial. If women disappeared from the story at the moment of crisis, where else does this pattern appear? The record does not compare events, but historians can. Across raids, wars, and conquests, women vanish from the page precisely when their vulnerability increases. The implication is consistency, not coincidence. If chroniclers believed God witnessed all suffering, why did they not record all suffering? The sources do not reconcile this contradiction. They selectively moralize pain. The implication is that divine witness was filtered through human comfort. If silence surrounds women here, was it unique to Lindisfarne? The record does not say, but repetition elsewhere answers the question. This silence is not an anomaly, it is a method. If chroniclers could imagine male martyrdom, why could they not imagine female endurance? The sources do not explain, they simply exclude. The implication is that endurance without honor was not worth preserving. If we search for women in the margins, what do we find? Gaps, abrupt transitions, moments where the narrative accelerates unnaturally. The implication is not absence, but removal. If history were complete, would these questions exist? The chroniclers do not invite interrogation, they assume closure. The implication is that closure was declared prematurely. If the story were finished, would the silence feel so heavy? The record does not measure weight, but readers do. The implication is that something essential has been withheld. If women did not matter to the record, does that mean they did not matter at all? The chroniclers never confront this. They do not need to. Their authority depends on not asking. If we follow the text faithfully, where do the women go? They do not flee. They do not die. They do not survive. They simply stop existing on the page. The implication is not historical reality, but editorial choice. If a story loses its people, what remains? Dates, places, institutions. The implication is a version of history that remembers structures and forgets bodies. If this silence repeats often enough, what does it become? Not a gap, not an oversight, but a pattern. And patterns are not accidents. They are systems doing exactly what they were designed to do: preserve what is comfortable, protect what holds authority, and allow the rest to disappear without protest. This is not the absence of evidence, it is the presence of deliberate quiet. And it is here, in the questions that were never written down, that the missing story begins to take shape.
Captivity. The word appears neutral, administrative, almost passive. In historical writing, it signals a change of status without demanding further explanation. To be captive is to have crossed a boundary, from free to unfree, from protected to transferable. What the word does not translate on its own is how completely that boundary erased what came before. In Norse society, captivity was not an interruption of life, it was a reassignment of it. A captive was not temporarily held. A captive was reclassified. What disappears in the word is continuity. Family ties are assumed to dissolve. Previous roles are assumed to end. The past is treated as irrelevant once ownership is established. Taking. The term suggests motion, a beginning and an end. Someone takes, something is taken. The grammar implies efficiency. In practice, taking a person was not a moment, it was a process. It began with separation, removal from place, language, and familiarity. It continued through transport, waiting, redistribution, and it ended only when the individual's identity had been sufficiently replaced. The word does not capture duration. It does not capture uncertainty. It does not capture the fact that taken often meant never returned. Spoil. In the sources, people sometimes appear under the same category as objects. The word does not differentiate. It collapses distinctions. Spoil is that which has value because it can be transferred. Its worth lies in movement, from one owner to another. When applied to people, the term removes individuality entirely. The translation is quiet but absolute. A human life becomes an asset, not symbolic, not metaphorical, economic. Enslavement. The term exists, but it is rarely expanded. It is treated as a known condition, requiring no elaboration. In the Viking world, slavery was integrated into social and economic systems. It was not hidden. It was not exceptional. It was regulated. Enslavement did not require cruelty to function. It required normalization. A person's labor, body, and future were reassigned by custom rather than chaos. The word does not convey how final this reassignment was. There was no expectation of return to former life. There was no institutional mechanism for recovery. What the term hides is permanence. Ownership. The sources use the concept freely. It is presented as self-evident. Ownership meant control over labor. It meant control over movement. It meant control over reproduction. What the word does not articulate is how ownership extended into every aspect of existence. Time was no longer personal. The body was no longer private. Choice was no longer assumed. Ownership did not need to be violent to be complete. It only needed to be recognized. Assimilation. The term sounds gradual, almost peaceful. In reality, assimilation was a replacement process. Language was the first layer. Names followed. Custom came last. Cultural memory could not be maintained without community. Once separated, remembrance became impractical, then impossible. Identity eroded not through force, but through isolation. Assimilation did not require consent. It required proximity and time. The word hides the fact that erasure can be slow and still total. Conversion. Religious language appears frequently in the period. Conversion is often framed as spiritual transformation. For captives, conversion was less about belief and more about survival. Shared faith eased integration. Difference prolonged vulnerability. The word does not indicate pressure. It does not indicate imbalance. It presents acceptance where accommodation was often mandatory. Conversion reads as choice on the page. In life, it functioned as adaptation under constraint. Trade. The sources speak openly of markets. Routes are described. Exchange is normalized. Human trade did not require spectacle. It required networks. People were moved as commodities, valued, priced, negotiated. The term does not describe weighting. It does not describe assessment. It does not describe reduction of personhood to measurable traits.
Trade implies rationality. That implication shields the system from moral interrogation. Value. The word appears repeatedly, though rarely explained. Value was determined by utility, by age, by physical capacity, by reproductive potential. The sources never paused to consider how value stripped away everything else. Skill mattered more than memory, usefulness more than origin. Once value was assigned, humanity became secondary. Integration. The term suggests inclusion. In practice, integration required compliance. Roles were assigned, not chosen. Belonging was conditional. The word does not capture how integration depended on forgetting. Forgetting names, forgetting places, forgetting languages that could not be shared. What integration offered was stability, not freedom. Labor. The sources acknowledge work without describing workers. Labor filled farms, households, workshops. It sustained the visible economy. The term does not account for exhaustion. It does not account for repetition. It does not account for the absence of alternatives. Labor becomes background noise in historical writing, constant, assumed, and unremarkable. Reproduction. The word is rarely used explicitly, but its implications are present. Female captives occupied a specific economic position. Their bodies carried future labor, future allegiance, future erasure. The sources do not dwell on this. They do not need to. The system understood the value implicitly. The word never appears. The consequence does. Household. The term sounds domestic, contained. Households were units of control. They regulated food, movement, and sleep. They absorbed captives into structures that normalized subordination. The word does not distinguish between family and possession. It allows both to coexist without conflict. Status. Social rank mattered deeply. The sources are clear on this. Captivity assigned the lowest status by default. Movement upward was rare and conditional. Security depended entirely on another's interest. The term does not express precarity. It does not express how quickly circumstances could shift. Status reads as stable. In reality, it was fragile. Silence. This term appears nowhere in the sources, but it is present everywhere. Silence follows captives across records. Once taken, they stop being tracked. Their lives dissolve into categories. The system did not require silence to function, but it depended on it to remain unquestioned. Normalization. The final translation is the most important. None of these terms were considered remarkable at the time. They were part of the expected order. They did not require justification. The language reflects that comfort. Words are clean because the system was accepted. What the vocabulary accomplishes is distance. Distance between action and consequence, between process and person. When the record says someone was taken captive, it is not describing a moment of capture. It is describing a complete transfer of existence from one social universe into another, with no obligation to preserve what was lost along the way. The phrase feels small on the page. That is not an accident. It was designed to be. Because if the words remained narrow, the reality behind them would not have to be followed. And once translation ends, silence becomes easy to maintain.
History speaks here, though quietly, almost apologetically. It offers explanations for what was omitted, rationales for the absence that persists. It is not defensive in anger, it is defensive in calculation. We did not write it, history begins, because to write it would have been unbearable. The chroniclers knew the limits of comprehension, the boundaries of public decorum. To describe suffering without sanctioned meaning risked unsettling every reader, every scribe, every institution that relied on order. Silence, in this view, is not negligence. Silence is prudence. And yet, the prudence itself indicts the story, showing that the unrecorded was consequential enough to require concealment.
We remained silent because shame cannot be catalogued, it continues. The texts describe desecration of holy ground, loss of treasures, death of monks. These are quantifiable. They fit neatly into moral frameworks. Women's suffering, particularly that which touched bodies or violated cultural norms, was unquantifiable. It lacked the language that could reconcile exposure to belief, sin to salvation, or violation to instruction. The silence is not neutral. It reveals a hierarchy of pain, one that elevates clerical deaths and minimizes other human consequences. We could not write everything, history says. Space on a page, attention of the audience, legitimacy of memory, each had limits. The chroniclers chose what could fit into coherent narrative structures. Chaos of lived experience, fear, endurance, entrapment was incompatible with neat paragraphs. To record women's suffering fully would have required explanations too uncomfortable to sanction. Yet the avoidance itself becomes a witness, a gap that documents precisely what was deemed unfit for preservation. Theology demanded discretion, history explains. The church defined virtue, sin, and witness. Martyrdom was socially and religiously significant. Suffering outside ordained frameworks, especially sexualized or private suffering, risked theological confusion. By excluding it, chroniclers protected the coherence of doctrine. What the text preserves is order. What it omits is chaos. And yet that protection carries weight. Omission is itself a statement of priorities. We prioritized the institution over individuals, history admits. The monastery was recorded, its treasures accounted for, its clergy named. Women's experiences did not confer the same institutional significance. Preservation of authority, reputation, and continuity took precedence. It was safer to abstract suffering into categories that could be absorbed into morality tales, rather than risk unsettling scrutiny of power structures. Here, justification doubles as indictment. Authority was preserved, but humanity was deferred indefinitely. Silence serves as organization, history continues. Categorization requires exclusion. Chaos cannot be faithfully recorded, it must be represented symbolically. Women's experiences, dispersed and subjective, did not fit symbols approved for record. By leaving gaps, the chroniclers structured the narrative, but they also smuggled erasure into history. The absence becomes a structural feature, not an accident of oversight. We could not acknowledge certain truths without causing scandal, it explains further. Violence that crossed gender, sexuality, and sacred space carried implications too destabilizing for public record. To admit the full extent of harm would require confronting uncomfortable realities, failure to protect, vulnerability of sanctuaries, fragility of human dignity. Silence transforms moral discomfort into editorial choice. By rationalizing omission, history protected itself, and in doing so, confirmed what it left unrecorded. Omission is a tool of preservation, history offers. It preserves moral clarity for the intended audience. It preserves the integrity of sacred institutions. It preserves the reputations of those tasked with safeguarding lives. It preserves what can be mourned collectively. The unrecorded, too complicated, too shameful, too morally challenging, cannot be incorporated without undermining these objectives. Yet in being protected, it becomes conspicuously absent, a shadow confirming the depth of what was withheld. We chose abstractions over details, history concedes. Loss became symbolic. Fear became metaphorical. Women's experiences could not be generalized without violating social and religious norms. Thus, abstraction acted as erasure. The more carefully history justified itself, the more it revealed what it had concealed. Every justification carries weight, it continues, voice calm but unyielding. Every appeal to prudence, decorum, or theological propriety validates the act of omission. Yet each rationale silently confirms the presence of what is hidden. If it were not important, it would not have required explanation or avoidance. We left gaps because to record everything would have been disruptive. Coherence was valued over completeness, chronology over comprehension, moral clarity over moral complexity. The chroniclers preserved the narrative, but they sacrificed the nuanced reality of lived experience. Those gaps become indictments as much as absences. We edited moral discomfort, history acknowledges finally. Every silence, every omission, every selective inclusion is a form of moral management, not by accident, not by neglect, by choice. And choice implies responsibility. History explains why it chose, and yet in doing so, it allows the audience to perceive what was deemed unrecordable, to measure absence against expectation, and to feel the weight of what was deliberately avoided. We preserved what could be preserved: order, institution, doctrine, and by preserving those, we necessarily left much else unspoken. The very act of preservation highlights what is missing, what could not be included without risk. The unrecorded becomes visible precisely because it was consciously excluded. Silence is not emptiness, it is intention. It is editorial authority exercised over memory. It is the shadow side of history's voice, justification folded into absence, prudence folded into erasure, institution folded over individuals. We speak through gaps, history whispers, not because it is unaware, not because it is innocent, but because it must appear coherent, reliable, and complete. The audience is invited to read the explanation, and in reading, to discern the truth behind the carefully constructed calm. Every rationale becomes a mirror, reflecting not what happened, but what was never to be recorded. Every justification exposes omission as a deliberate choice, every silence as a statement. The absence of women, the erasure of suffering, the deliberate concealment, all are rendered audible by the explanations offered in their defense. History defends itself, and in defending, it reveals the shape of what it could not defend, the human experiences rendered invisible, the moral weight deemed inconvenient, the cost of coherence carried not by authority, but by those who had no voice. Silence, it seems, has a logic, and that logic is as telling as any word that was ever written.
The story you think you know is incomplete. You remember shock, desecration, sudden death. You feel it. You have always felt it. History, however, only now begins to catch up. This was not misremembering. It was deliberate. The narrative was compressed, sanitized, and organized. The inconvenient truths, the lives erased, the suffering uncounted, were set aside. What remains is not error, it is a choice. Civilizations record trauma selectively. They label it, categorize it, and reduce it to symbols that can be absorbed comfortably. Pain becomes abstract, bodies become background. History learns to breathe without noticing those who made it possible. Lindisfarne is not unique. Across time, across borders, across cultures, the same patterns repeat. Institutions protect themselves first. Memory is edited for coherence. Those who were most vulnerable are often the first to disappear. We have traced the invisible alongside the visible. The missing names, the silences, the gaps. They were not accidents. They were structural, intentional, deliberate. This is a correction, not a revelation. The truth has always been known emotionally, now it is recognized intellectually. The island was cleaned, not because events were small, not because people did not suffer, but because history demanded clarity, and clarity, in this case, came at the cost of truth. Observe the pattern, notice the absences, feel the weight of what is implied. The story is simple on the page, the reality never was. This is not forgotten history, it is managed history. This is not misremembered history, it is deliberately edited history. And in that editing, we see both the power of authority and the cost of its choices.